The topic of our talk is the four unsolicited questions, and it really centers around how to handle questions that people really shouldn't be asking you in the first place. How to deflect them, how to see to it that it doesn't negatively affect you. And I'd like to speak to you, to our A-Time members, and I would also like to include some content or much content to your family and friends in the hope that perhaps you may find it helpful to forward this to them or to give them the information about this call so that they can get a better window into your souls in a way that you may not be comfortable sharing with them. The governing principles that form my thinking on this, and I acknowledge the contribution gratefully of many people who emailed me with advice and people who had gone through infertility. I posted on social media this morning that if anyone could be of help, they should please send advice to me. It really was extraordinarily helpful, and much of the content of this talk is based on a lot of really good advice that came in. The governing principles here are number one, you decide, and number two, protect yourselves from toxic environments. When I say you decide, that means I really firmly believe that couples who are struggling with infertility and dealing with the whole range of what's going on all year long, I really believe that you should decide. You should decide if you want to go away or if you want to stay home. Decide who you want to go to. Decide if you want to play with other people's children. Decide how much of the Pesach Seder, a lot of it is very child-centered, some of which may make you uncomfortable or awkward or may not. I really, really believe that you should be making these decisions. A very wise woman who struggled with infertility for over a decade emailed me and said, you should go where you're most comfortable, not where you're expected to go. And I think it's brilliant advice. To parents and family members of people who are dealing with infertility, understand the grieving process. It's not in a straight line. It's not the same for everyone. Not everybody processes it the same. And people have different triggers themselves as to what triggers a more intense grieving period. Let's step away from infertility for a moment and just think of what it looks like to be suffering from the loss of a loved one. I myself sat Shiva a few months ago for my mother, Allah Shalom. And these are the components that we go through. There are 5 stages of the grieving cycle. And not everybody processes it the same. We have 5 siblings. We all took it a different way. We're all grieving, but some have a more stoic appearance, some are more likely to be emotional, and most of us switched around an awful lot during Shiva and even now in all our conversations with each other. There are also triggers. Obviously, Yantif is a trigger because you want to be with your family, just as Yantif is a trigger for people who are struggling with infertility. and understanding this and really stop wondering about why they aren't doing this or why they're doing that. Just give them the space to be. You don't know what's going on in any particular time in their life. They may have just finished a very painful treatment that didn't work out. They may be about to start something that's getting them very anxious. They may be under advice of doctors at certain times to just relax and enjoy their time together. So we don't know any of these parts. People who are outside looking in really don't know this, and I think it's so important that you just let them be. I'd like to share with you a very interesting insight. Many years ago, I started asking individuals or couples who came to me for a variety of issues pertaining to things in their family, pertaining to their own personal struggles, and people that I don't know who call me from other communities or just come as a one-off just to meet with me once. It's not an issue with, but people who I see every day or I see often in the community or I bump into afterwards, I started asking them as follows. Would you rather I give you a bracha, a blessing, when I see you and say, "Hey, Yitzchak, Moshe, I hope everything is going well. I'm really davening for you. I'm praying for you." Or would you rather I just ignore the fact that we spoke and just give you your privacy? And the vast, overwhelming majority of people just ask for privacy. Just treat me the way you treated me the day before you knew about this confidential matter that I shared with you. And I really got a lot of this from my mother, Allah Shalom. My mother actually struggled with infertility for 10 years. I remember so often hearing from her about what that was like. And then she lost her husband after having 3 children. She was left a widow with 3 children under the age of 5. And so often she would mention to me how she just wanted to be like anybody else. And people would look at her and say, put some makeup on, Bela, you're going out in public. Just because your husband died, you still have to look good. And other people were telling her, you're wearing too much makeup, you're grieving, you're in the year. People say very foolish things sometimes. We should be judging them favorably and realizing that they're tongue-tied and they don't know what to say. But it's really the topic of this conversation, of this talk. So it's very important for people on the outside looking in to give the couple their space. Just let them be. Let them decide what they want to do. And any other way, just give them support, with a hug, a support with your eyes, but really let them be themselves. Another issue is this whole matter of protecting yourself from toxic environments. And I think it's really important that people who are going through extremely challenging times are entitled to not have the bandwidth to deal with challenging situations that will just compound that. And I think it's important for couples to understand that even if one spouse can tolerate a toxic environment or a particular toxic environment well, that doesn't mean that the other spouse is doing well with it. And I think communication is so important. I really plead with you to support each other, no matter what's going on in your extended families. If there is a toxic environment that you're going into, I really believe that you should stay away from it. I think at this time you just need to be selfish. A family that I'm dealing with has a teenager that's extremely rebellious, and the teenager is dressing in ways that are very far from the norms of Orthodox Jewish society, and doing antisocial things. And I've been advising the parents to just lay back and deal with it in certain ways, but not comment on their external trappings, which I think is pretty good advice, generally speaking. And one family that I was dealing with called to ask the following question. They go to their parents for the holidays, for Yantif, and this particular family, the grandfather of the boy, really did very poorly with this and was constantly making derogatory comments. And they asked me what to do. And I said, have you asked them to stop? And they said, yes. So I said, stop going. Absolutely stop going. Don't go back there. You can do one last conversation with the parent and say, listen, my child has asthma and you're smoking. And you need to stop smoking if you want me to come to that environment. But that's really what it is. The child chokes on negative feedback. And if you feel that way about yourself, about getting into an environment where you have to either endure this or never know when the next negative or uncomfortable comment is coming, I really believe you shouldn't be going there. And even though there are Halachic Jewish law implications regarding kibbud av v'em, regarding the obligation to respect one's parents, I respectfully suggest that that does not apply in a situation like this. I'd like to share with you a poignant, moving, and beautiful psak, a halachic ruling that I heard from Rabbi David Cohn, who related an experience that he had with Rabbi David Feinstein. And I asked Rabbi David Cohn a question about a couple that were very uncomfortable going to one set of grandparents regarding a general child safety matter. And Rab David shared just an extraordinary halachic ruling, a Jewish law ruling from Rabbi David Feinstein, the son of Ibad L'chaim Tovim, the son of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And here was the story, and I'll relate it all because I really believe it's important. There was a 30-something-year-old man in Brooklyn who was a lifelong stutterer. He wasn't able to cure it. He went to all sorts of therapists and therapy, tried self-correcting. Nothing was working. And he found an alternative speech therapist who said that he believed that he would be able to cure him, and in fact mentioned that he had cured other people, a whole host of people for whom conventional therapy didn't work. And this radical approach was that the patient would agree not to speak at all for a period of 4 to 6 months, not a word to anybody. And once they got out of the habit of speaking, he would retrain them in speaking properly. Now, I'm not going into whether it is or isn't appropriate, or it isn't clinically sound. I'm certainly not qualified to say that. But this gentleman felt that this was his last chance. And he went to Rabbi David Feinstein and said that I spoke to my doctor and I told him I need to pray 3 times a day. And the doctor said, no way. So he said, can I at least recite the first verse of Kriya Shema? Can I recite one verse that is a Torah obligation for every Jew to say Kriya Shema every day? And Rab David answered that he did not have to, but his logic and the reasoning was fascinating. Rabbi Feinstein explained that we have a halacha in Jewish law. One is not permitted, or one is not advised to spend more than 1/5 of his assets on a positive Jewish commandment, on a mitzvah saseh. That means if someone has a net value of, and his assets total $10,000, and there's a lulav and esrog that he could purchase for $2,000, so it's not recommended that he do that. So Rabbi Feinstein explained what's the logic behind it. That God says, I would like you to do these commandments, but I don't want you to do it if there's an extraordinary self-sacrifice that's necessary. Now, negative commandments are a different thing, but this is the rule for positive commandments. And Rabbi Feinstein said, for you to walk around for the rest of your life stuttering and feeling uncomfortable, that is way more than 1/5. That's your soul itself. That's your actual nefesh. And he told him, you have absolutely no obligation to recite Kriya Shema. Go do the treatment, and we hope it's successful. And Rabbi David Cohn applied that to the family who was uncomfortable going to one set of grandparents. And I believe humbly that it applies in this case as well. If you're going to spend Yom Tov, Pesach or Shabbos or any other time in the presence of people who are going to say hurtful things, obviously you try to do what you can to get them to stop. But if that's not happening, you're not obligated to go. You shouldn't be going. You're not, in all likelihood, you're not in a position that you can afford to go. Let me go to the actual the topic, which was, responding to the 4 questions. And I think also here, I think it's important to really differentiate. We have the 4 sons. We have the Chacham, the wise one, the Rasha, the not good one, the Tam, a simpleton, and a Sheni de Lishal, somebody who doesn't know what to ask. And I think people who ask inappropriate questions or questions that make you uncomfortable, I think they're really divided into 2 categories. There's a Tam and Sheni de Lishal. There are people who just weren't blessed with high EQ. EQ is emotional quotient, knowing how to interact socially. And some are Sheni de Lishal. They just don't know what to say. They just don't know what to say in these situations. They don't know what to ask, and therefore blurt things out. And I think for these people, try to be as polite as possible, but if it reaches a point where you're uncomfortable and really getting uncomfortable, I think you should say something. A polite way would be to say, look, this is a private matter. We're taking care of this. Thank you very much. I appreciate your concern. Our sages, to all parents, family members, extended families of a couple struggling with infertility, our sages had the greatest advice for people who were sitting Shiva, who were paying a Shiva visit, and that was be silent. Just go to the house, sit down, and just be silent. Your presence is comforting. You don't need to say anything wise. Just stay there. And then let the mourner, let the person who you came to help, let them, he or she, decide how much they do or don't want from you in terms of conversation. And I think that's great advice for all of this. Be there, be supportive, but really give them space. That's probably what they need most of all. My wife and I have been spending Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur the last 4 years with recovering addicts, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, or other types of addiction. And it's a real lesson to watch the way they support each other. They are so desperately in need of support. They hug each other, they support each other. None of them asks the other, how are you doing? How many days have you been sober? It never happens. They're just there for each other. And there's a certain body language that conveys this message without words. And I think that's probably the most helpful thing you can do. If you're financially in a position to help the couple, the fertility treatments are astronomical in terms of what it costs. And if you can help like that, it's certainly appropriate to say, listen, can I offer you financial help? But other than that, I really, recommend to step back. The other types of questions come from a chacham, and I don't mean this literally, a smart person. I mean a wise guy, or people who just aren't nice. I'm sorry to say, part of the human condition is there are some people just who aren't nice. And I think I would like to give you license to just say what you have to say and let them know that their conversation with you is not welcome. I hope I'm not offending anyone by saying this, but that's the way I feel. During Shiva, look, we all knew that in Shiva, people come, the vast majority of people were really wise and smart and said good things, but some people didn't. 5 years ago, we sat Shiva for my stepfather, the wonderful man who married my mother, raised us. He was married to my mother for 46 years. And when he passed away, we all, the three of us, my three full siblings, is yours, mine, and ours, but my two siblings decided to sit Shiva in his honor and respect. It was a no-brainer for all three of us. Independently and together, we decided to do that. So not many people, there were thousands of people in the Shiva home probably, in the course of a very long week. But several, not many, just a couple of people asked me if I had asked a Halachic ruling. Did I ask a rabbi if I should be sitting Shiva for a stepfather? And depending on the mood and depending on how I felt it was presented, whether it was presented just foolishly or it was presented, just being, someone thought he was being cute, I had three responses, mildest to not so mild. The first thing I said was, well, Abba, my stepfather, Abba. I said, Abba didn't ask a shaila. He didn't ask a rabbi when he married a woman with 3 young children. So I don't think I need to ask a question either. The second answer was, I wouldn't listen. I only ask a question of a rabbi if I'm prepared to listen. And if anybody told me not to respect my stepfather, I wouldn't listen to what they said anyway. And the third one, which I only said to one person who was really, quite frankly, obnoxious, I when he asked me, did you ask a shaila of a rav? I asked him, did you ask a shaila if you should ask such a silly question to someone sitting Shiva? Now, I'm not necessarily proud of having said that, but I'm not really sorry about it either. So take literary license to do what makes you comfortable. Again, protect your space. See to it that you support your spouse. This is so important because we don't always see eye to eye on things. Usually, we most the times we marry people whose nature is very different than ours. So, if you don't mind these toxic comments, and your spouse does, even if you don't understand why he or she is taking it personally, I really beg you to be supportive. You have to rely on each other. Your relationship with each other is so important in this situation. Finally, my last thoughts are about really interacting with God during this time. And Passover, Pesach, and the Yom Neram, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, the high holidays. These are all times where we have more time. We're off work. Our social media is down. Our electronics are off, and it gives us a time to reflect. And the prayer services, the Seder, the other prayer services, tend to get us in a closer relationship with God, communicating more. And for many of us who are struggling, it's a very hard thing to do. You're facing God with a very heavy heart, and it's perfect. But I'd like to leave you with two thoughts. The first is a story from the Baditchev Rav, the Reb Levi Yitzchak of Baditchev, who was known to always be a supporter of the Jewish people and a defender of the Jewish people. And the story goes that he was in the synagogue one day. He was in shul, and a poor farmer, came into the synagogue, into shul, ripped open the Aron Kodesh, the covering on the Holy Ark. He opened it up and stood in front of the Sifrei Torah, in front of the Torah scrolls, and he started yelling at God in the first person, like the first person to you. He said, "Hey God, how could you do this? What happened was he had one cow, and that cow gave milk and did some, helped with used it to work around the field or whatever else he was doing. And his cow had died, and he was brokenhearted, and he came into the synagogue to yell at God. And he said, God, you couldn't take a cow from rich people? You couldn't take a cow from someone who has 1,000 cows, a whole herd of cattle? You had to take my only cow." And he started yelling. So the people in the synagogue, the other people in the shul, were approaching him to yell at him. And someone said, "Oh, chutzpah, how dare he speak to God like this?" And the Baditchev Rav said, "I envy his relationship with God. He's comfortable enough to talk to God in the first person like one would speak to a friend. And he's comfortable enough to raise his voice when he's upset with God. And he's comfortable enough yelling at him and pleading his case." And I think there's a lot to be said, because very often when we go through tragedy, we feel like that. We're angry, we're ticked off, and we're not in the mood of facing God. We're not in the mood of doing rituals and some of those things. And it's okay. Baditchev Rav gave us a gift. He gave us the gift and the luxury to be ourselves. Because in a real relationship, if you love someone, you're always, the depth of your love and the depth of the emotion, almost automatically, at some point in time, you're going to go through difficult times and stress. I believe that it's okay to go through these range of emotions with God. And even during this very holy time of Passover, of Pesach, to be yourselves, speak to God in your own words, when you're in synagogue, when you're in shul, even if the prayer books don't cover everything, they don't. Utilize the opportunity to talk and to pray to Him. And one last thought. I had an opportunity to pay a Shiva call with Rabbi Moshe David Tendler, who's a rabbi here in Monsey, and he's a son-in-law. His father-in-law was Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and Rabbi Tendler and I we met at a Shiva home of the Shiva home was One where a very young man had passed away, like in his 30s or early 40s, very young, tragically. And Rabbi Tendler mentioned something so profound in the name of his father-in-law. And he said that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein had gone to pay a shiva call also to a situation where someone died very tragically and very young. All deaths are tragic, but some more than others. And Rabbi Tendler was accompanying his father-in-law, Rabbi Moshe, to the shiva call. And Rabbi Moshe was sitting there with the mourners and asked a question that I never thought of, but that was so profound. And he said, our tradition, the Gemara mentions, the Talmud mentions this, and Jewish tradition has it, we learn from our sages, that in this world, when we hear bad news, we make a bracha, Dayan Emes. Baruch Atah Hashem, blessed are you, God. Dayan Emes, who is an honest judge. Dayan is a judge, Emes is truthful. And what we're saying is that this judgment, this bad news that God gave us, we accept it. That's what we say at a funeral when we see a mourner tear their garments, rent their garments. That's what they say. Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam dayan ha'emes. When we have good news, we make a bracha called Hatoiv v'Hametiv. We thank Hashem for good news. We make a Shechianu when we get to a good time in our lives. Toiv is good, Meitiv does good. So we thank Hashem who does good for us when we hear some good news. Now, Rav Moshe said as follows. He asked a profound question. We believe, or we're supposed to believe, that everything God does for us is good. Even things that we find painful and difficult, we're supposed to believe that every single thing God does is out of love, and we're supposed to accept it. So Rabbi Feinstein asked, if that's the case, why don't we walk the walk? At a funeral, we should make a Toiv Metiv. Why do we make a Dayan Emes? Basically, Dayan Emes says, hey God, I don't like what you did. I'm upset about it. It's bad news to me, and therefore, but I'm accepting it. But shouldn't we walk the walk and make a Toiv Metiv? And Rav Moshe said something so profound that our Chachamim, our sages, in formulating these two distinct blessings, they were giving us the license to understand that this is how I'm supposed to feel. I'm supposed to feel that it's good for me, but I don't feel this way now. I feel it's terrible. I feel it's heartbreaking. And therefore, I'm making a Dayan Emes. The sages suggested that we make a Dayan Emes because human beings, the vast majority of human beings, just aren't on that level that they can take difficult news and thank God for it. And I think that's my final message, is that it's okay to understand that on some level we're supposed to believe that everything Hashem does is good, and everything, hopefully, one day we'll come to understand it. But at this point, it's okay to feel Dayan Emes. It's okay theologically, as far as Jewish law, as far as Hashkafa is concerned, that's okay. So, in closing, I just want to wish you all of you, just a beautiful Yantif, a meaningful Yantif, an uplifting Yantif. And from the bottom of my heart, I wish you all that Hashem should answer your prayers and grant you your deepest wishes. Have a wonderful Yantif, everyone.